We now turn to Cantos 7 and 10 through 10 of Dante's Inferno. and at this point, we'll see that Dante will reach the fourth circle, which begins or commences with Cantos 7. So in entering the fourth circle, he encounters another guardian of that circle. In this case, it is Plutus, who the name comes from the ancient Greek god of wealth, wealth in ancient Greek being Plusia, and so Plutus is the god of wealth. Here he's depicted as a demon guarding this circle, and he's also another demon that utters sort of irrational gibberish. In this case, he says Pape Satan, Alepe. Translators and interpreters of Dante's Inferno are kind of baffled as to what Dante wants to say here, though there is the interpretation that suggests that Plutus is kind of just shouting out in anger to the lord of the underworld, which would be Lucifer, and just simply can't speak in a rational language. So again, we see here that the demons have lost all sense of rationality due to their fall. Of course, Plutus is symbolizing the damned over whom he guards within the circle, and that consists in those who are avaricious, the greedy, and those who are prodigal, that is, those who overspend. And in this section, they push and crash stones together. Here we have an instance of Sisyphus, who we encountered in the underworld that Odysseus had traveled through, and he saw some of the sufferings, and one of them was Sisyphus pushing the rock up the hill, and it falls forever, eternally. We see here the avaricious and the prodigal. They push and crash stones against one another. They hurl insults at one another about their sins. So there's this opposition here, because the greedy are those who take, and the prodigal are those who give and overgive, destroying their own sustenance and the sustenance of those perhaps over whom they're supposed to take care. Now the prodigal, that is those who spend too much, have what's called a tonsure, a shaven top, and the tonsure was a look, or was worn in a fashion, by clerks, popes, and cardinals. And so Dante's accusation here is that the individuals during that time, they're taking in donations, and they also receive tax, and they use the wealth that they receive to excess, and they spend upon themselves rather than spending for example, for the sake of the poor, or they just give great grand feasts, etc. And so they're depicted as the prodigal, even though the prodigal don't include only the clerks, popes, and cardinals. All the prodigal within Dante's depiction of hell here in this fourth circle have this tonsure. Let's just proceed quickly then into circle 5, which now takes part through Cantos 7 through 9. And here Dante encounters the wrath, or the wrathful, and the sullen, or sullenness. So wrathful is a type of anger, sullenness is a type of kind of anger that one internalizes. Both are in this case steeped in a swamp, which in this case, here is Styx, another river which occurs in the ancient Greek underworld. And the wrathful are attacking one another, so they're expressing their anger, as somebody who's angry does, shouting and cursing, etc. And the sullen are repressing their anger, as one who, for example, gets angry and keeps it in, and perhaps plots revenge, and the anger becomes poisonous, and so the sullen, as opposed to the wrathful, they sink into the swamp. You see here this opposition is used as in the opposition between the greedy and the prodigal. They encounter another boatman, Phlegias, and who is, of course, unwilling to carry them over across to the river of Styx, but of course is compelled to by the power that Virgil has been given through God. And here we have a depiction of Dante traveling, and Virgil across with the boatman, and here you see that the undead are trying to crawl in, which is indeed what happens. As they cross, a soul rises from the swamp, and Dante recognizes him. It is Filippo Argenti, who is a member of the Black Party, and he grows angry when Dante recognizes him. He says, "Aren't you Filippo?" And you can ask, well, why does he get angry with Dante? And the answer is reputation, that since Dante is not dead, Dante will eventually leave the underworld, leave hell, and he can go back to Florence to inform everyone, hey, guess who I saw deep in the pits of hell, in a swamp, in this case, in the swamp, I saw Filippo. And so Filippo is still, even though he's suffering in hell, he still thinks back to his own reputation, which shows where his real concerns were in life, and that he's only concerned about that even in death. He tries to get onto the boat to attack Dante, but Virgil throws him off. And here's a very interesting statement that Dante thereafter makes. He says, I've got a hankering, a desire, to see them dunk that spirit. And Dante's words lead the other damned souls within the swamp to attack Filippo as a result. So notice here the contrast between the individuals here in the swamp, right, and compare that to Dante's reaction to the lustful who are whipped by the air. Dante then felt mercy, and he was even felt sorrow. Here he feels no sorrow at all. In fact, he feels anger. And he causes a soul to be punished even more. So at some point they move on and they approach the great gates here of Dis. Okay, and here's just a little sort of picture of it, which is from the tradition. And we have some of his statements. Now, my son, we draw, as Virgil states, near to the city they call Dis. And he says, I discerned the turrets of its mosques behind the boat. So notice that's an interesting point. He sees mosques, very odd. Like iron from the forge, they glow and burn. And what happens is that as they approach this city, fallen angels oppose the once closed entrance. So what happens is that during the harrowing, when Christ enters the underworld to free the Hebrew prophets and saints, the parts of the underworld are broken from the earthquake which it causes. So because from the gospel story there's a great earthquake when Christ dies. And so the angels fall from the sky of the underworld and in order to protect it. And this is here the city called the City of the Damned in this case, one of the cities in fact. So this scene here is important because it serves as a parallel for the earlier rebellion of the fallen angels against God. And they really start to disturb Dante. And in fact, this is a scene which is quite disturbing at some level, so much so that he uses this literary device where he addresses the reader, and he says, consider, reader, because they say to him, Dante, you will never leave. And in fact, Virgil is unable to oppose these angels even with the authority that he has been given. They refuse to move. So they're being rebellious here against God. And he says, consider, reader, because it seems that as though Virgil has no power over them, whether I was not distressed in hearing these words. Okay, so they're saying, Dante, you will never leave. And Virgil's saying to them, no, you must give way. I have authority. And they say no. So this is a real problem. Then the Furies arrive. The Furies were these Greek goddesses that kind of served as a representation of one's own conscience, and what they would arise when someone committed a great and evil act, and they would pursue the guilty individual as this kind of fate or fortune and conscience that pursues one. So they arrive and they call the Medusa to destroy Dante. The Medusa is another sort of mythical individual, and she is one of the three sisters of the Gorgons, the Gorgona. She has snakes for hair, and if you look into her eyes, she will turn you to stone. Eventually, she's slain by the Greek hero Perseus, and even in death, her head is still dangerous, in fact. So Virgil covers Dante's eyes. So this is a scene in which Dante finds himself in deep distress and trouble. It will not be the only scene, in fact. There will be another scene or more in which he finds himself in similar predicaments. So Virgil, therefore, in order to obtain further aid, invokes an angel from heaven, and an angel arrives. And notice here that the angel is kind of similar to Hermes, the messenger god. The angel arrives and rebukes the demons, waves a wand, in fact, and the gates open. And the angels remind the demons that Dante is not the first man to enter Dis. Notice here Dante may be referring either to the other katavases, the other types of descents we see in literature, such as Homer's Odyssey and Virgil's Aeneid. He may also be referring to Christ's entry into hell, the harrowing of hell. Of course, Christ is not only man, but also equally God. So there is this reference here. We turn then to circle 10. And the heretics, and this leaves us with a number of memorable scenes, especially of their punishments and the individuals that he encounters. Now the heretics comes from heresy. A heresy is a belief that one might hold or teach contrary to an established norm, doctrine, or dogma which is held by an institution. In that case, the medieval Christian church. Now, during that time, around the 12th century, the medieval Christian church established what was called the Inquisition in order to root out different forms of heresy that were beginning to brew during that time. And they would use various inquisitorial techniques in order to sort of draw out the false beliefs. A lot of these techniques were in fact quite tricky, and they were also used to trick those who were being inquired into. And unfortunately, along with this, they would use various forms of torture, and if it weren't the inquisitorial techniques, it was certainly the torture which got the unfortunates who were drawn into these nets to confess to either to real heresies or in most cases to heresies that they were falsely accused of. And guilty heretics, in order to purge the soul, were burnt at the stake. In hell they receive a similar and terrible punishment. The heretics are internally entombed in flames, in hot flames, so they must lay down in a tomb of hot flames. And as he passes by, a man rises from the tomb, Farinato. This man, who was one of the patriots, Ciacco, the hog, had earlier mentioned him. He stands, now this is very important, Dante has him stand straight up in the flames and calls him magnanimo. So what we see here is Dante, even though this man is here entombed in the flames, and certainly a damned heretic, Dante nonetheless represents him positively. Okay, and so this is kind of a strike against some of the political individuals who would oppose that particular party. And here he sees that he was a Florentine leader of the Ghibellines. He's eventually defeated by the Guelphs. And here was the really nasty thing that happened. After his death, he and his wife are posthumously, after their death, excommunicated. So what is that? Excommunication means excommunicare, out of communication. To be excommunicated means that basically you're thrown out of the church, that any possibility for salvation is denied to you. And this is possible, the church holds that this is possible, due to the following passage from the Gospel of Matthew, which is stated by Christ to Peter, to Simon Peter. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. And so the church, seeing itself as the descendant of Peter, thus has that power to either bind on earth and therefore to excommunicate you from the kingdom, or to loose in heaven, and thus allowing you to be to enter into heaven, for example, through confession. Now, in this case, it's a rather nasty political tactic which is used in the medieval times, this tactic of excommunication, which was available to popes and bishops, for example. And so what they do is they take, for example, the opposing political party, the man is dead, but what they do then is they, in fact, excommunicate them after their death. And one of the reasons they might do this is not only to kind of help to destroy the opposing party, but after an excommunication, they could actually seize all of their property and goods that would have been given to their children, and to those who they endowed them to. So these are nasty tactics, and Farinata is an example of these nasty political tactics and strategies and sort of warfare that's really going on between these families in Florence at the time. And as you can see here, certainly Dante doesn't agree, and he sees Farinata, though excommunicated, as opposing even this hellish kind of fate that he has received. So still he's kind of standing up and opposing it. Now, in contradistinction, we have Cavalcante de Cavalcanti. He rises from the tomb, and he's actually in the same tomb as Farinata, but he's only able to lift his head, and it shows the difference between the two men, both in terms of their sort of their character and also their party affiliation. So one which Dante would agree with, and the other not. One is from the Ghibelline, and the other from the Guelph. And Cavalcante, who is unable to raise his whole body from that Guelph party, and certainly not as strong and noble as Farinata. So the two are wed here in eternal damnation due to the fact that Cavalcante married his son to Farinata's daughter to bridge any hostility between the two families and their parties. An unfortunate event happens here with Cavalcante. He asks Dante about his son because they were actually good friends. And Dante speaks of him in the past tense, his son Guido. And he says, yeah, I saw Guido. Yeah, he was doing fine, basically, okay? And he misinterprets this. Thinking that his son is dead, he falls back into the tomb in great distress and sorrow. Okay? So this is just a kind of interesting scene that unfolds. A few other historical figures are encountered. Epicurus, the great ancient Greek philosopher who taught that the good in life was the pursuit of pleasure. He also taught, and this is a heretical position, that the soul dies with the body. This would stand in contradistinction to church teaching, which teaches that the soul lives on and that there is a resurrection of the body. And he also taught, also a heretical position, that the gods are not concerned with us. So he is unfortunately damned with the other heretics, and unlike the other philosophers and pagans in limbo, he is here with the actual damned and deeper punishment. We also have Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor. That should say that date there is wrong, around 1194. And he was called the Stupor Mundi, the wonder of the world, sort of Frederick the Great. And his court was really a place of intellectual excellence and accomplishments. Unfortunately, he, as many intellectuals within history, he would often have falling out with especially with the Pope and with some of the bishops, and he was therefore twice excommunicated, and therefore finds his position here along with the other heretics and in hell. And then we see Cardinal Ottaviano, and he fought against Frederick, but later on was deemed heretical as well. Here's a little interesting note, something that I mentioned earlier when talking about Odysseus' travels in the underworld. Farinata informs Dante. He says, the damned have the power to foresee the future, but as their sight approaches the present, it becomes unclear so that they cannot really see what's going on in the present. That's why he asks him about events that are happening now. So this is a parallel to farsightedness, hyperopia, the ability to see objects at a distance, and those same objects become blurry close up. So what we see is the damned have no glasses. They can only see the future, and they cannot see the present. Now this is really important because it adds to the despair which the damned face in hell. If you recall from the words written upon the gates of hell, abandon hope, all ye who enter. The damned see the future, and they see basically eternally into the future, and they see that eternally into the future they are still damned, and that there is no hope. There is no hope now, and there never will be hope. So it's a very interesting, sort of very clever addition that Dante adds to this ability of the damned. They have this prophetic ability, and yet that prophetic ability only adds to their sorrows because seeing the future, they see that their damnation is eternal. So let's turn now to Cantos 11 through 17, and we arrive on circle 7, the circle of violence. And on this circle, there are actually 3 types of violence which serve to separate the damned. There's violence against one's neighbor, which is the first ring, against oneself, which is in the second ring, and against God in the third ring. And you see how these circles are depicted within this picture here. As they enter into the circle, they encounter another guardian who is the Minotaur. And a mass of boulders covers the path as well, which is also a result of the harrowing of hell and the great earthquake which destroys part of the damned, such as the city of Dis, as we saw. The Minotaur rages at them. He bites, and he bites himself. Again, we see this irrational demon bites itself, it rages, it can't really speak intelligibly, and of course it's furious because it can't stop them from continuing. Now, what is the Minotaur? It's basically an animal with the head of a bull and the body of a man. And it's a story which originates from lust, violence, and love. We have Pasiphae, who was the king of Minos, a great tyrant of Crete. In fact, he was a terrible tyrant. She decided to have sex, and desired, in fact, with a white bull, this apparently beautiful bull. It was a bull, though. And she has Daedalus, who is this renowned artisan of ancient times, rather. He's kind of the human, let's say, interpretation of Hephaestus, the god blacksmith. She has him construct a fake cow, and she proceeds to crawl inside of it, and the bull therefore copulates with her and produces the Minotaur. She gives birth to the Minotaur. The Minotaur, being this rather nasty beast, is placed into a labyrinth, and Daedalus is also required to construct this. Now what happens is that every year Athens, the great city of Athens, must send 7 youths and 7 virgins, and King Minos demands this in order to pacify the Minotaur, and also as punishment for killing his son. Well, one year, finally, the Theseus is sent, and Ariadne, the daughter of Minos, falls in love with him, and she helps him to devise a plan to kill the Minotaur. He enters with a sword, and he uses a ball of thread in order to get through the labyrinth, though. So he's tossed into the labyrinth, and he starts unwinding the thread because the labyrinth was so sophisticated. It was the great contraption of Daedalus that no one could ever escape. Even if the Minotaur were to be killed, he would still have to get out. You should notice here the interesting parallel to the types of difficulties that Theseus must face, and the way he overcomes it through cunning, or metis, and the types of difficulties that Odysseus faced, and the types of metis or cunning that he used also. So in the end, he kills the Minotaur. He's able to get out with that ball of thread. So we get to the violent first against one's neighbors. And in this we see another river, Phlegathon, that boils with blood, and immersed in it are the murderers and thieves. Around it patrol centaurs. You see this, more beasts, mystical beasts of ancient lore. They have the head and torso of a man and the body of the horse. And they shoot arrows at anyone who rises up from the river. So you have to remember that it's boiling with blood, so you would want to get out as much as you can. But as soon as they rise up, an arrow is stuck into them. And the centaurs speak to Dante, and eventually Nessus, one of the centaurs, carry them over. So in mythology, the centaurs are actually conceived as brutal beasts. They're cruel, they're lustful, they're nasty. Not all of them, though are. Nessus, for example, who is featured here, he's in fact later killed by Hercules, the great Hercules, the son of Zeus, the great, who is depicted in the ancient world as sort of with strength and various properties that would be befitting to the son of the king of the gods. Anyhow, he's killed by Hercules after Nessus attempts to rape the wife of Hercules. Big mistake. In this case, Deianira rather. And but she had received a gift from Nessus, which was given to Hercules, a poisoned cloak that would eventually be his undoing. Another one that's mentioned, Pholus, who sought to steal a bride from a wedding, resulting in a kind of war between centaurs and human beings. And then there's Chiron, who in fact is a kind of more, let's say, less savage centaur, and he was depicted usually as a leader and also as a tutor. He was the tutor of both Hercules and Achilles, and you should understand he didn't teach them the typical things that we would have learned, which we learn in the university. He would taught them such things as how to throw a spear, how poetry, music, and how to ride a horse, for example, things such as that. Things that, for example, a noble warrior would need to learn. So we move on to the violent against oneself. Notice here we have individuals embedded in the trees, right? And there's thorns around them. So the violent against oneself here are those who commit suicide and those who have squandered away their life by some sort of waste, which is different from those who sort of the spendthrifts who spend all their money, who we saw in opposition to those who are greedy. The squanderers are those who kind of have a life that they could have lived, but instead they choose to do nothing. And so they end up wasting their life. Now, those who commit suicide are embodied in a tree of thorns, as we saw, and the thorns themselves cause pain and harm to them. Virgil has a tale such as this in his Aeneid, just as a side note. The squanderers kind of have a worse punishment to some extent. They are pursued by dogs who chase them throughout that ring, and they tear them to pieces once they are caught. Just as a side note, because I haven't mentioned this, you might be asking yourself all this time, well, if the dogs tear them apart, then, okay, what happens? Aren't they now destroyed? And so what about the eternity of hell? Well, what happens is that, again, the body of the damned is kind of constituted by, you could think of it as air molecules. They're kind of like ghosts, you see, but they're constituted by air molecules. But it's still a body. Harm can be done to it, and it can be destroyed, but once it's destroyed, it reconstitutes. You can think of it as the soul is a kind of vacuum, and it just sucks up that air molecules back to itself and becomes full again. And then, of course, they're set in the same context, and they are then destroyed. Now, another way of thinking of it is like a video game where you travel in the video game, for those who have played those things, and the character gets killed in some way, or a car game even, it gets crashes, and then you start from the beginning. Well, this is kind of the idea in the Inferno and the underworld in terms of the damned, that they can be destroyed and they kind of have to start all over again. So a little bit of a note on suicide for those of you who probably thought about it, because it seems kind of cruel to leave. For those who commit suicide, it seems kind of cruel to put them in hell. This was, however, the teaching on suicide of the medieval church. It was denounced, first of all, in antiquity. For example, Socrates, who was the great ancient philosopher, compared life to a guard placed at a post. So if you imagine that you are in war and you are placed at a post to defend a post, and you see that an army is approaching, okay, now you could do one of two things. You could of course try to hide, but apart from that, you could try to oppose them, knowing that you're going to die, or you could run. So of course let's say the cowardly thing would be to run, because in that case, you're only doing more harm upon your comrades, whereas at least you could have helped to stop these individuals at some point. But of course, you have to sacrifice your life in that. Now, what he's saying, Socrates, is that in life, well, the body is not our own possession. It's a possession of the gods. And in fact, it's given to us. I guess the idea here, the metaphorical idea, is that, well, we are mortal. We're born into life, and we will die at some point. So between that time, it's kind of, the body's kind of on loan, and so we have no right to just kind of destroy the item that's on loan and to remove it whenever we feel like doing so. And also it would be cowardly to do so, akin to a guard at a guard post who runs. In life, we're given this life, and we shouldn't just run whenever we feel like it or feel afraid or for some reason. So this is kind of the ancient view. The Christian view in suicide becomes a form of violence, we see, that's equivalent to murder. Why? Because you should never kill another human person. If you consider yourself, you are a human person, and killing that person, you kill someone that's a person, so you thus commit a type of murder, which is mortal sin. There are, however, especially in more recent times, exceptions can be made in cases of involuntary action. So what's the difference here? Involuntary action would be action that's compelled in some way. For example, if someone says that I have kidnapped your family and I will do them harm unless you go and rob the bank. Okay, you go and rob the bank, you get caught eventually, let's say your family is rescued, and now you're in court. Well, you can say, look, they had my family, so even though I did do it, it was involuntary. Okay, so now suicides can often result from involuntary types of actions, such as depression, the fear of being tortured, for example, or raped. For example, if an army is coming, there are actual instances of this in the Christian tradition where nuns have committed suicide rather than being caught and being raped, and this type of suicide was considered acceptable. And these are seen as involuntary acts. In other words, the individuals would not do them if they were not compelled to do so. These types of actions, let's say, are forgivable. There is an evil there because a person is being killed, but the evil is akin to defending oneself as in war, or in other cases where the aggressor is killed. Someone is killed, but it's not quite murder. It's a form of self-defense, or it's a form of, let's say, some sort of mental illness, in which case there is not a kind of voluntary consent. Voluntary is different, and voluntary sin is in fact punishable. Here we have the notion of mortal sin. A mortal sin, from the word mortal, is a sin for which damnation is warranted. And so if you recall from the 7 cardinal sins, the worst types of sins, mortal sins could be attributed to those different types, for example, to greed and to murder, etc., and to wrath, whatever. But the main component here, one of the main components, is that the sin has to be done voluntarily. So it's action without compulsion. It's action that one chooses to do. And here we can see suicides resulting from something like a protest. So you can say, I don't like the way that this country is being run, so as a form of protest, I'm going to go and, I don't know, kill myself in some way. And you could say, well, this person was quite rational in their action, and they chose to do it, and this is a terrible and grave offense and sin. Because indeed their body is on loan here, and they don't have the right to do that. So you see there's various moral questions behind suicide, but it's not as simple as the medieval conception often portrays it, or as we often portray the medieval conception of suicide. Unfortunately, those who committed suicide would be they would not be able to be buried with the Christians, and they would be considered to be damned. So this view has certainly changed. So the Harpies come, and here's a little picture of the Harpies. They're kind of like the sirens of Odysseus, the Odyssey, and they descend upon the suicidals in the trees who are embedded in the trees, and they have a head of a woman and the bird body, and they start to eat the leaves. And so you can think of the leaves as the hair. Now what happens is that those who have committed suicide are embedded in these trees. So what happens is that their bodies are not air as the other souls. Their bodies are, in fact, the trees. So remember, a soul and a body have to be a single composition, and in this case, the suicides have a body of the tree, and so their hair would be like the leaves, and maybe their fingers too. And so the Harpies come and they start to eat this, and this causes pain, so this only adds to their suffering. The Harpies are mentioned by Virgil, as I said, in the Aeneid. There's also, as I said, a possible parallel to the sirens in the Odyssey, but in the Aeneid they arrive within this context here, where Aeneas and his crew sail to the Strophades, the Ionian Islands, and there they prepare a great feast, and the Harpies swoop down twice and they eat the meat, and so they're these nasty birds, and they also leave droppings, nasty droppings, right, excrement, on the food, so they get really kind of angered at this. The third time Aeneas fights them off, and so here they are within Dante now, Virgil's Harpies, within the Inferno, swooping down on the suicidals embedded in the trees and kind of causing them terrible pain. We encounter another historical figure, in this case within the suicidals, Pier della Vigna. And that's from the vineyard, his name there, Della Vigna. So Dante walks by and he picks off a branch, snaps it off, basically snaps off someone's finger, and blood oozes out, and the man screams, and he announces who he is. It is Pier, one of the great poets of the Sicilian school, and he's in fact a spokesman of Frederick II, who we saw in Circle 6 in the Heretics. He's falsely accused of betraying the emperor, and he received a terrible fate. They blinded him in some way, either by putting a hot brand in his eyes, and he's placed in jail. There he commits suicide out of despair. Either the tale is he bashes his head against the wall, or he jumps out of the tower as Frederick is walking by. So a terrible end. In this case, to an individual that Dante thought highly of, at least in terms of his poetry. We go now to the next ring, and this is the Violent Against God. Notice here this kind of field of rain in which they languish in. And here, the violence against God is depicted also in three forms. Those who are violent directly against God, the blasphemers, those who curse God, those who are violent against nature, the sodomites, okay, those who commit indecent, that is, sexual acts, and those violent against God's works, the usurers, the lenders, in other words, those who lend money with interest. So these condemned are in a desert. This is a desert, I should say desert, which rains burning flakes of fire that ignite the sand. The blasphemers, being the worst, because they offend God directly, are forced to lie facing down. So a very nasty kind of punishment for them. And here he encounters Kapaneus, who's this kind of giant of an individual, and he's actually depicted in Statius, in the Thebaid. It's a Roman epic, which is kind of like the Iliad, it's the Thebaid, which depicts a war against Thebes. One theme there is that the man Kapaneus, like Sisyphus kind of, defies the gods, and but he's also presented as a kind of courageous individual, He does some courageous acts. For example, he doesn't attack the Thebans at night because he says it would be kind of incorrect to attack them in secret, whereas we should be facing them out in open warfare. So I guess he wasn't quite the great strategist, but he was at least a courageous individual. In any case, his basic punishment comes from having climbed a mountain and shouting out against Jove, the name given for Zeus. He says, "Come now, Jupiter, and strive with all your flames against me, or are you braver at frightening timid maidens with your thunder and raising the towers of your father-in-law, Cadmus?" Now you can imagine what happened after this kind of foolish shout. Well, Zeus is he flips a finger and he's struck by lightning and dies. So Capaneus is here depicted in the underworld, and he's there depicted also as still quite blasphemous and standing opposed to his fate, kind of like Farinata was. Another individual is encountered, Brunetto Latini, and he was a Guelph who lived as Dante, most of his life though, in exile. He composed a number of works, one of which is called the Treasure, which is an encyclopedic work, and it speaks of eloquence, and it says that eloquence is beneficial only when combined with wisdom, kind of a view that originates in the ancient philosophy, especially with Socrates. Now, Dante here shows real affection for him and respect. What's odd about this is that he's depicted as a sodomite, even though he's married with 3 to 4 children. So Dante is basically saying that he has had certain relations which were indecent. Even though he's married, how he would know this is, of course, unknown. Now, a little note here on homosexuality and sodomy, because the two are certainly not the same. Homosexuality here, we have intimate relationships between men. This is condemned as contrary to nature. And penalties, if one were discovered during that time as practicing homosexuality, would have included confiscation of property and capital punishment, or even execution. So, despite this, homosexuality is in fact quite prevalent in Florence, and interestingly, Dante includes known homosexual men in the Purgatory, which means that within the context of Dante's Inferno, it's important to differentiate between homosexuality or homosexual love as such and the sexual act of sodomy. Why? Because sodomy as a sexual act is itself an unnatural act, and it not only includes male-to-male relations, but male-to-female relations. And of course, the sodomites are here in the 7th circle of hell. So what this says here is that love can be between individuals of the same sex, and so the punishment is not the love, but rather the unnatural acts that are incurred between them. So it's quite different here. And there's also, and finally, Geryon. So they reach the 7th circle and a cliff, and Virgil takes Dante's sash and hangs it down, and a beast, here as I say, flies up. This is Geryon, which is a symbol of fraud. So he's depicted as this kind of chameleon. He has this changing reptilian hide, a scorpion's body, and a beautiful face. And so you might say, well, why is that a good symbol of fraud or deception? Why? Because the individual who deceives, you'd say, is two-faced, right? Interestingly, he flies through the air like a swimmer, Dante suggests, through water. And this shows you the kind of realistic way in which Dante tries to depict the various characters, thus giving to the Inferno a more kind of lifelike, realistic added flavor to it. And then he transports Dante to the next ring, down to the next ring, and we see this interesting kind of description and depiction of flying within the Middle Ages.